So that said, it's my great pleasure to introduce Leah, who is a friend and colleague and one of the leading voices nationwide and who knows beyond in connecting the gospel with the ecological crisis and the climate crisis. Leah is a Lutheran pastor. She is assistant professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary. And she's written a number of books which are totally relevant to our conversation this afternoon. She's the author of Creation Crisis Preaching, Ecology, Theology in the Pulpit, also of Preaching in the Purple Zone, How to Preach to Politically Diverse Congregations. How the heck do you do that? And I know her best as a co-editor with me of the anthology Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis, which, as you may know, is a collection of 21 essays from a range of religious traditions, everyone speaking about their emotional and spiritual resources as they address the climate crisis. And it has study questions and spiritual practices, and I'm hoping it will actually be a good resource for preachers. Leah also, and I will just add that Leah and I have never met in person. So Leah, the day will come when we actually get to shake hands, to give each other a hug, a real hug. We did the whole book online by email and Zoom over the last couple of years. Leah has been a featured speaker for the Festival of Homiletics. She leads workshops and retreats, and she keynotes events throughout the country. She has served as an anti-fracking and climate activist, a community organizer, and an advocate for environmental justice issues. And she's a blogger, the eco-preacher blogger for Patheos. Is that how you say it?
Patheos, yeah.
Patheos.com. She's unbelievably productive, I will honestly say. And I love it, Leah, that you are launching us in this experiment. We're starting strong, so thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Well, thank you for that wonderful welcome. And it's great to see all of you on this call, and just to know that there are pastors who want to have these conversations and ask these questions. So my hope is that I'm going to give you some frameworks, some biblical and theological frameworks to use, not just for this week, but for the weeks ahead and just for your preaching in general, and some tools to use specifically for this Sunday's sermons. So I'm going to just do a brief PowerPoint here and talk to you about the concept that I think is sort of the overarching theme that I think can work for the text. And I'm looking at I'm looking at primarily the readings in the Revised Common Lectionary that are assigned for the Sunday, not the alternate ones, so the primary ones. So the framing question that I'm asking is, who is my neighbor, and how do we think about preaching and creation? So as Margaret mentioned, these are some of the books that I've written. I have a new one coming out actually called Apocalypse When: Interpreting and Preaching Apocalyptic Texts, which when we finished writing it back in January, it was right before COVID. And so we had no idea it was going to be so timely, but that's coming out this fall. So I just want to remind you again, you know this, but I think it's just good to have some grounding on why it's important for us to be preaching about environmental issues. There was a study done back in 2014 by PRRI and AAR that Americans who say their clergy leader speaks at least occasionally about climate change are more likely to believe it exists than Americans who tend not to hear about climate change in their church. So more than 60% of Americans who have heard about climate change from their clergy are at least very or somewhat concerned about climate change, as compared to only 40% who attend congregations where the issue is rarely or never raised. So they're listening to us. And I know this has been a politicized issue. It's not a political issue. It's not a partisan issue in and of itself. It has been made into that, but it is an issue of politics in terms of the polis. The root word of politics is polis, meaning of the citizens. So yes, it is political in that sense, but it should not be a partisan issue. And so for pastors to give permission for us to ask the kinds of questions that Margaret just posed to us, which I think, I don't know if you have those that you could put into the chat, Margaret, but they were just wonderful. I'd love to have those. I just think they were really wonderful questions. So first of all, I want to give you some principles for reading and interpreting scripture from an eco-justice perspective. These are from Norman Hobble in his book, Readings from the Perspective of Earth. The first one is the principle of intrinsic worth. And this means that the universe and all its components have intrinsic worth and value, that they're not just valued as a commodity. The second is the principle of interconnectedness, that the earth is a community of interconnected living things, mutually dependent on each other for life and survival. It is not compartmentalized the way capitalism likes us to think about it. The third is the principle of voice, that earth itself is a subject, not an object. So a subject capable of raising its voice in celebration and against injustice. So it's really interesting to think about, okay, where does earth have its voice in scripture? How can we give voice to earth through our preaching? And I might be able to talk a little bit about some sermons that I've done, well, towards the end of our time together, to give you some ideas to spark your own creativity with that. The fourth is the principle of purpose, that the universe, earth, and all its components are part of a dynamic cosmic design within which each piece has a place in the overall goal of that design. The fifth is the principle of mutual custodianship. Notice it's not stewardship. That has too much of an economic connotation, so custodianship is often the word that's used in eco-justice and eco-theological circles. But the idea is that earth is a balanced and diverse domain where responsible custodians, meaning human beings, can function as partners with, rather than rulers over earth, to sustain its balance and a diverse earth community. And then finally, the principle of resistance, that earth and its components not only suffer from human injustices, but actively resist them in the struggle for justice. So as you are thinking about your sermons, as Margaret mentioned, I do want to recommend looking to the book Rooted and Rising, because there are some really great essays in here that can provide you illustrations for your sermons, because the activists who've been doing this work and wrote these chapters have some really poignant and powerful stories that they share from all of these different perspectives. I really think of this as like a bouquet of environmental religious witness that I think provide wonderful sermon illustrations. Now I want to share with you a schematic that I have used that I developed for the book that Margaret mentioned, Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry and the Red-Blue Divide. And this is 5 paths to prophetic preaching. And you'll see that this schematic is rooted in the metaphor of a tree. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because you might be able to think about, okay, what direction do I want to see my sermon going here? So the primary principle is that of rooting. So we are rooting in biblical principles and theological frameworks that show us that the Bible gives us permission and authorizes us to address issues of public concern, and in this case, environmental issues. Another aspect is what I call flowering. So we're just trying to raise awareness about this. We're asking the questions. Again, those questions that you had, Margaret, they're just so good. They're conversation starters. They're just letting people know that if we can talk about it, it's something that we can invite God into that conversation. So that leads us to pollinating. And we want to show that the Bible itself models different voices disagreeing with each other about how to deal with the land, how to deal with the water, how to deal with each other in community when they're deciding how to custodian these resources. So when we can say, look, people in scripture were dealing with this, it's okay for us to deal with this as well. That's really important. Another aspect of prophetic preaching is what I call leafing. So when you raise awareness about things and you get people talking, to have a place for them to land with this energy is really important. Not that we have to dictate, like, you must show up at the stream cleaning event on Sunday after church, but just to say, look, here's an opportunity to live out our faith. What will we do with the awareness that we have, with the ideas that have been generated here? So we suggest ways that they can respond in faith. And then finally, the aspect of what I call fruiting. So this is more sustained conversation over a longer period of time. It's not like, okay, I'm going to preach my Earth Day sermon and then boom, I can check that off the list. We're talking about conversation and what I now call homiletical accompaniment over a longer period of time to help people process this, dialogue about it, bring it into sermons, what they've been talking about, so that they can hear their own theological reflection mirrored in the sermon. Because we're really talking about a kind of culture change here, so that we move beyond just the fight or flight when it comes to dealing with difficult issues, to finding a way to engage that doesn't put people off and feel like they're being shamed because they don't agree with a particular political agenda, but really invites them into thinking deeply about what their faith is, who we are as the people of God, and what that means for the world. So as we're thinking about preaching the lectionary texts for this Sunday through a green lens, I want to offer you some thoughts. As I said at the beginning, the concept of neighbor is, I think, really a really powerful platform for the text for this Sunday. And I'm drawing this particularly from the Romans 13 reading. And I'm just going to read the first 3 verses. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. But the question is, who is my neighbor? And this question, of course, came up in the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke, where the lawyer challenged Jesus. Sure, I totally agree with what you're saying here, but who do I consider my neighbor? Who do I really have to take care of? And so in the book I wrote, Creation Crisis Preaching, I want to expand our thinking about who we consider our neighbor. The case that I want to make is that it's not the qualifications of the one who suffers that should determine who we consider neighbor. The neighbor is the one who chooses to care and thus makes themselves a neighbor. So neighborness isn't initiated by the one who's lying beaten on the side of the road. It's determined by the one choosing to act in a caring way toward another. So the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, is really, who is worthy of my moral consideration? Who qualifies? Who can I exclude and not feel bad about myself? But Jesus turns that around. Who will you choose to care about? Neighborness is not determined by the receiver of the compassion, but the giver. So from the Samaritan's perspective, the only qualification for neighborness was the suffering of the beaten man. All other lines, all walls, hierarchies, divisions, that all falls away. So I'm going to be putting into the chat a handout for how to map your neighbors in creation in and around your church. And this is excerpted from Creation Crisis Preaching. But it's an exercise that you can do with your youth, with your Sunday school kids, when we're back together after COVID, with an adult education class, to think about who are, what are the streams that are our neighbors? Who are the trees around us? What lives on the ground that supports this earth and supports this church? Our animals are neighbors. The mountains, the ecosystems. How far down the food chain should we go? How far afield should we go? And in what ways does this interconnectedness of the cycles of life have a moral component for how we live and work and drive, and what we buy, and where we get our energy? So what I'm saying is that we need to apply this idea of neighborness, not just to the human realm, but to the other than human realm. So yes, we have to care for those, the least of these, such as babies in the womb, children, women who are biologically and historically among the vulnerable human beings. We need to prioritize their health when we make decisions. But we also have to think about the biotic cycle in general, the most basic building blocks of life. And anything that would threaten the most basic levels is something we need to avoid. So this means that we're not determining what's okay for us to do as humans from a top-down level, but really from a bottom-up and this interconnected way. So if it's not good for the kids, if it's not good for the microbes in the soil, if it's not good for the little fishies in the sea, then it's not going to be good for us in the long run either. So another way to say this is, the least of these are what Jesus has said are the most sacred. So whatever promotes their health and well-being fulfills the divine command of caring for them. So I took this concept of who is my neighbor, and I taught a class about it. And I took my students to Eastern Kentucky for an immersion course called Who is My Neighbor in Appalachia? And we started thinking about who are our neighbors in the coal mines, on the mountains, in the streams that get the runoff from the coal slurry spills, in the congregations that have both activists and coal miners in them. How do we think of neighborness this way? How do we think of the watersheds? How do we think about just the region itself that has been so maligned and mocked and made fun of and exploited? The people, how are the people of Appalachia our neighbors? And a primary question that we learned came from a Catholic priest who said, always ask this question: what is it like to be you in this place? So ask that question of your neighbors, including your other than human neighbors. So here's what I'm inviting you to think about in your small groups. An overall question is, how do you see the concept of neighbor in these texts? And how can you articulate it in an expansive way to include our other than human neighbors in creation? And when we break you into small groups, I'm suggesting that you look at the 4 texts with these questions. So with the Ezekiel text, what does it mean for the church to be a sentinel to our neighbors when it comes to warnings about environmental issues resulting from sinful human activity? In Psalm 119, if the law of God is written within creation itself, what does it mean to learn God's statutes and ordinances? I should say statutes, not statues, sorry. When it comes to our other than human neighbors. In the Romans text, in what ways can the church help people wake from sleep and live honorably when it comes to caring about God's creation and protecting both human and other than human life? And then in the Matthew texts, how can we help people talk about the need to tackle the climate crisis and other environmental issues in a way that's in alignment with that process that Jesus gives us in that passage about how to confront your neighbor. So with that in mind, just a few final thoughts. When you are preaching environmental sermons, be sure to proclaim the good news, because there's so much bad news. We need to share stories of where people are acting to protect God's creation. We need to show how we can participate in God's redemption of earth. Not that we're given this false hope, everything's going to be fine. Great big daddy in the sky is going to come down and clean everything up for us. That's not what we're saying. We are preaching what I call an eco-resurrection, that just as Jesus was resurrected with scars, so is earth being resurrected, even when we can't see it, even when we are in the midst of this Good Friday moment, or at least the Saturday vigil, that there is a resurrection, and we are called to give witness to that.